On April 1st, 1976, three men signed a piece of paper in California. Two of them were in their 20s. The third was 41. His name was Ronald Wayne. He typed the agreement himself. He drew the company's first logo. Steve Jobs had brought him in because they needed, in Wayne's own words, an adult in the room. Jobs took 45%, Wozniak took 45%, and Wayne was given 10%. 12 days later, he took his name off the document and sold that 10% back for $800. Later, he accepted $1,500 more to permanently give up any future claim to the company. Apple is worth around $4 trillion now. That stake would be worth tens of billions today, possibly hundreds. Wayne is 91, living in Nevada, relying heavily on a Social Security check and occasionally selling rare stamps and coins. You've heard this story. You've heard it told as a joke, the idiot who sold Apple for $800. That version is wrong, and what's underneath it is a lot more uncomfortable than the joke. Here's what gets left out of every retelling. Apple wasn't a company that day. It was a general partnership. And in a general partnership, the liability is unlimited and personal. If the business took on debt it couldn't cover, creditors could come after the partners themselves. Not their investment in the business, their houses. So put the three signatures side by side. Jobs and Wozniak were in their 20s with essentially nothing to their names. If Apple collapsed under a mountain of debt, creditors could seize roughly nothing from them, because roughly nothing was what they had. Their downside was capped by their own emptiness. Wayne was 41. House, car, savings, 2 decades of assembling a life. All of it now standing behind a company that was 11 days old. 10% on the page for each of them. Not remotely the same wager. And that's the thing people skip past when they talk about who's willing to take risks. Risk tolerance gets described like a character trait, something brave people have more of. It's mostly a balance sheet. The young founder betting everything is often betting nothing, because nothing is what's on the table. The 41-year-old who walks away isn't short on nerve. He just has more to lose, and the arithmetic knows it even when the story doesn't. It cuts the other way too. When your downside is capped at 0, recklessness looks a lot like courage, right up until the day it stops being capped. Almost immediately, Apple landed its first real order. A retail store wanted 50 or 100 computers. To build them, Jobs borrowed $15,000, and the buyer, by Wayne's account, had a reputation for not paying its bills. Read that the way he read it. $15,000 of debt, personally guaranteed by all three of them, resting on a customer who might simply not pay. In 1976, $15,000 was more than most Americans earned in a year. The question in his head wasn't whether the computer thing would work. It was simpler and much closer to the ground. If that check doesn't clear, who covers the $15,000? He knew the answer. The one with a house. That gap matters because it's the same gap that shows up in almost every decision like this one. Survival wins in nearly every human being. Not from cowardice, from proximity. The concrete risk with a due date 30 days out is something the mind can actually hold. The abstract one 20 years out barely registers as a thought. The debt was a number. The $4 trillion company was not yet an idea anyone on Earth could have had. Nobody sells the future. They sell the present, and the present is all that's ever in the room. Now the part that makes the joke version fall apart completely. Ask what he thought he was purchasing by leaving, and he's answered it for decades consistently. He was standing in the shadow of giants. He'd never have a project of his own. He'd end up in the documentation department, shuffling papers for the next 20 years. His line to CNN was that if he'd stayed, he'd have ended up the richest man in the cemetery. So the 10% came attached to a job, a specific desk, beside two people who were going to make every real decision for the rest of his working life, which raises something unpleasant. If someone had told him in 1976 exactly how it would go, every product, every split, the $1 trillion valuation, the whole tape, would he have stayed? He says no. At 91, he said his success was never defined by money, but by acting with clarity and integrity given what he actually knew at the time. You can decide that's 50 years of rationalizing, and he's admitted himself that it would have been nice not to worry about money. But that red costs you something. It costs you the assumption that everyone around you is playing the game you're playing. Some people aren't trying to maximize the number. To them, the number was never the point, and no amount of hindsight makes it one. And this one is about you rather than him. 10% of Apple would be worth $400 billion. It's also not really true. Apple raised money. It took on investors. It went public in 1980. Every one of those events diluted the founders, Jobs and Wozniak included. And Wayne's 10% would have been ground down by exactly the same machinery. That's why the estimates you see swing wildly between $75 billion and $400 billion, depending on who's writing the article. They're guesses, and most of them quietly skip the dilution. That's the tame problem. Here's the real one. In the universe where Wayne stays, Apple is a different company. The debt gets handled differently. The arguments run differently. A cautious 41-year-old with a house on the line sits in every room and votes on everything. Maybe that version works better. Maybe it never survives 1977 at all. Nobody knows, including him, including you. Hindsight does something specific and slightly cruel to the brain. It takes the one path that happened and converts it into the only path that could have happened, then bills you for failing to see it in advance. I should have bought Bitcoin at $1. The universe where you buy at $1 and hold for 15 years doesn't exist. The one where you sell at $4, thrilled with yourself, is the one that keeps happening. We almost never regret a decision. We regret an outcome, then work backwards until it looks like a decision. Go back to the paper on the table in 1976. 2 men with nothing to lose and one with a house, a car, and 20 years of savings behind him. Same 10%, 3 completely different bets, and only one of them was risking anything real. 91 now, in Nevada, Social Security stamps and coins. Easy to stop there and call it the most expensive mistake in the history of American business. $300 million in and nothing out. A janitor's wage in and $8 million out. And now the largest upside anyone has ever been offered, declined for reasons that were, at the time, sound. Not one of those turned on intelligence. Not one turned on courage either. What separated them was what each man could survive losing and what he was actually trying to buy with the money. Wayne's own line at 91. I've never been rich, but I've never been hungry either. Whether that's peace or the longest running rationalization on record, I honestly don't know. Neither do you. And that uncertainty is probably the most honest thing in this entire video. Next time, the other side of the counterfactual. The lottery winners, the sudden money cases, the people who got the outcome without ever making the decision.